All right. I guess I already lost 20 seconds. Morning, everybody. Thanks for coming to this session. So just so everybody is aware, we are in the Navigating the World of User Data Management and Data Discovery. I'm Smitty. I work for VirtuStream, which is an EMC company. And just a little bit about myself. Where does this need to be pointed? I think the clicker is not working.
Oh, it is.
Oh, OK. All right. So yeah, I'm Smitty. I work for VirtuStream, and I've been with the EMC, sort of the portfolio of companies for the last 5 years. Prior to that, I was with Oracle. And my current role with VirtuStream is to help build a big data cloud services offering, if you will. And really, my background has been mainly with RDBMS databases. And in the last 5.5 years, mainly with Hadoop and NoSQL, which Pivotal and EMC have assets on. Right, so I'm also a part of the release team on the ODPI committee, which is the open data platform of which Hortonworks, Pivotal, and EMC are key sponsors and members, in addition to a lot of the ISVs. I have another session later this afternoon along with my colleague at EMC, where we are talking about building platform as a service with some of the tools that I'll talk about today briefly. But this talk mainly is around data discovery, as I said. Just, a little bit of infomercial on what VirtuStream is. So EMC acquired this company late 2015. And this is an enterprise class cloud solutions company that offers infrastructure as a service, platform as a service to enterprises. And what we mean by enterprises are those companies who want to have SLAs and performance and disaster recovery and backups defined in a very stringent fashion than what's provided by the public cloud providers. So there is that key differentiation. And furthermore, prior to EMC's acquisition and sort of the claim to fame for VirtuStream had been the invention of two core technologies, one of which is the Extreme Cloud Management Platform software. So this is a software that we use internally in hosting our customers' assets and solutions. So essentially in the public cloud, if you will, so off-prem from a customer point of view. And that's how we manage those applications and solutions. And it's very key because it allows us to look at resources and then build them further in a very micro services format. And the billing aspect of that translates into the micro VM cloud technology, which you see in the third bullet there. So micro VM allows you to then sort of really, as a customer, pay for the consumption of those services as opposed to the allocation, which is what you typically find in the AWSs and the Azures of the world. Now, from the point of view of what kind of services we offer, VirtuStream has been mainly an SAP landscape expert, if you will. And more recently, with EMC's acquisition, we are expanding our services around the storage cloud that we announced at EMC World this year. And then I'm working on the big data cloud development and sort of rolling out that service. So about this talk, I kind of submitted this paper with the intention to share a project that we'd worked with while I was at EMC with two of our clients. And it's interesting because the way that project started was mainly everything related to data lake. And then very quickly, it morphed into what we now term as a data management project as well. Right? So even though there is going to be, there'll be a couple of architectures that you might find quite confusing and quite elaborate, but I'm going to try to see if we can stick to the data management conversation if possible. But if there are more questions outside of that, I'm happy to take them as well. So really, I'll give you a bit of a project background, the high-level architecture and the data flow. And then, I would say this is also kind of a practitioner's point of view of what we found when we evaluated the data management tools, right? So I have been, I'm a vendor in the last 5 to 10 years, but prior to that, I was a consultant and a customer like yourself. So I've lived the life of having to manage production databases and not being able to figure out, where is the data that I'm looking for. So I would say that this is an extension of my attitude towards a practitioner who's trying to manage data management tools. So when you hear the term data management, it's so elusive, right? And as we sort of embarked on this project, we were like, there are so many tools in the market. And if you go today to the community showcase as well, you will find pretty much every tool having to do in some form and fashion some level of data management. or they're doing, security, or they're doing ETL, and they sort of overlap in so many ways that it's very confusing as to what would be a good tool to choose from. So again, my motivation in this, and the key takeaway I would say from your perspective, I would encourage you to try to find out what works from an evaluation perspective so that you can take that mechanism and implement that back in trying to find out what is the tool which is best for you. Right, so I have a couple slides which are more introduction, but I wanted to give a context of what the user data actually really means from our perspective as we kind of went on this project. So you have, the transactional data, and then you have the metadata associated to all of that, which is both business, technical, and operational. And the collective of that actually is what is an information. And in the context of Hadoop and everything that we're doing from an analytics perspective, it is implicit that information is of utmost importance. And of course, combined with that is the reference data, similar to what a lookup will be. And there are a lot of products that exist in the market for MDM, right? IBM Infosphere, Oracle MDM, and there are quite a host of them as well. And historically, they've really managed the structured RDBMSs of the world, point of sale systems or ERP systems. And that collective has what's been come to known as an MDM system. But as more customers are putting data into Hadoop, the fact that you have a different data format, like a JSON or an XML, and if you're not just doing analytics, but you're actually pushing that information back into your transactional system. So not only would you want to have the ability to go against a different data set, but you also want to have a product that allows that adaptive feedback, right? So the context of what we started exploring was the collective of this, not just the transactional systems. And the driving factors are quite implicit, right? IT is the custodian of all your business data. If business data is important and IT holds it, well, it's a collection of those two individuals in those organizations who are going to have to find what product is best. From a data characteristic perspective, I kind of alluded to this. Majority of the Hadoop implementations today are analytic. They are kind of hinging on transactional to a certain degree. More ETL is coming onto Hadoop that sort of started as an initial use case. So it's a collection of both, but as I said, most of this analytics data needs to go back into transactional. So how do you balance building a data model that encompasses both of those two kinds of systems? Volume and volatility, enough said on that, we all know that. Complexity of data type format. And then the other two, I would say, key factors would be the reusability and deduplication. So in my current role, in the past 5, 6, 7 years, as I've dealt with customers, their key motivation has been to not create the same databases or same Hadoop clusters with the same data set over and over again. So I think having an MDM tool, or I want to call it a management tool as opposed to an MDM in its true sense, but having this tool that allows you to identify that you're not proliferating your data in 5 different clusters is another important factor. So this is more, again, of an introduction, and I think the way I would look at this is 2 key things. It's an approach, and it is an application framework. It cannot be directly associated to a product. So you'll find a lot of different definitions online, and this is just a summary of that. And then the other aspect that I think is also very key is the fact that you need to have multi-domain and multi-organizational aspect to your product that you choose. So, and as I will start talking about the whole project started with 2 main customers, and they were both in retail. Right, so you have different domains, you have SKUs for all your products, and then you have the logistics and the supply chain. So how do you have a tool that goes across all of these different sources, and then also does analytics against each of these domains? Now, this is something you guys may have seen from your own research, but what I've tried to do is there is a process, people, and IT associated in this, and this is where, to me, it got really confusing. I'm like, okay, you're talking about data governance, but that's sort of a concept, it's not a product. And then what are the entities that build that data governance pillar, if you will? So fundamentally, there are 4 to 5 pillars, right? So you have a compliance officer or some kind of a person managing the adherence of a company to the governance. And very well be. So, however, from an IT perspective, that really translates to identifying a data sensitivity. What data is indeed sensitive? Is it HIPAA related? Is it SOX related? And so on and so forth. So, you would hear the terms PII and PCI, and that's data sensitive. Accessibility of that, what kind of operations can you do on it? So auditing is key. Who's accessing what, right? So security. So here's the other funny thing, that in each of these pillars, these are not, they're not in isolation by any means. There's always a gray area. So the next pillar is going to be security, and you would argue that, well, sensitivity is part of security. But depending on who you talk to, there's going to be a lot of overlap. So within the security space, most companies now, at least a majority of the enterprises that I work with, tend to have a chief security officer. So that CISO, if you will, identifies and makes and keeps track of things like who has access from a security point of view to what data. So what, where, how, and who are sort of the main questions, and that's the common theme across each one of them. Also from a point of view of building dev test environments, are you able to mask the data, right? Identify the users. Then from a quality perspective, this is where the curator comes in, right? How do you identify sources coming from 5 different areas are not using social security in a different format? Again, a standard 101 RDBMS concept. But this gets even more enhanced when you have unstructured data in JSON and XML, and then you try to map that to a Parquet file, for example. So this is where you want to make sure that from a quality perspective, you're able to maintain the right data, you're able to purge it, scrub it. From an integration perspective, what are the sources in the sinks? And I'll talk about in our project where we started, some of the data was flat files, some of the data was RDBMS. But when you try to find a lineage, not only do you want to make sure you know the source and the sink, but you also want to understand what the integration points are. Cross-platform accessibility, right? You're going from mainframe to Hadoop all of a sudden. Can you identify the lineage? And then in the middle, I would say, is a collection of all of these, right? You have to classify it. You have to understand the data. So search, identification, tagging, cataloging, and also logging sort of tend to become the key tenets for each of these pillars. Without that, you wouldn't be able to do any of these functions. And then furthermore, if you want to automate that, I would say rules and policies kind of become almost implicit. And I would sort of just close this sort of eye chart, I would say, from a people process perspective, right? The top is all the processes and the people that you need to be aware of. So then, as we were, again, doing this project, we were like, okay, but how prevalent is this, how, I would say, pervasive is this problem of trying to find a data management tool in Hadoop, right? And why for Hadoop? So this is something, and as I was building the slides, I figured it might be a good idea to see what are other customers looking at and what some of the, I would say, the analyst organizations by way of ESG or TDW are finding, right? So how many of you here have Hadoop as an enterprise data hub? Okay, so that's, I would say, 25%. And I think that's about the right percent, if you will, as it is reflected here. So the red is what is today, and in 3 years, what would you see as a growth pattern for using Hadoop in the format of an enterprise data hub? And then finally, the growth factor is shown in the green line here. But just the fact that you're moving away from RDBMS systems or mainframe systems, or even are coexisting with them and making Hadoop as a primary and a critical source of your data, you want to be able to have a data management that allows you to identify the data that's sitting in the enterprise data hub, right? So this, by definition, answers the question, why do you need a data management tool for Hadoop? And then at what stage? So this was an interesting question for us as we went down our project. The customer, as I'll go into the details of that, already had a Hadoop cluster running, but it was mainly for analytics. So one argument was that, well, let's go ahead and just do the analysis and do the data management and quality control on the data that is existing in Hadoop, but what about all the new data coming in? So funny enough, TDWI also did a research and a survey of about 250 respondents in this particular category. And they found that you would say that if the data is already loaded in Hadoop, as it is coming into Hadoop or getting loaded, as well as it's being retrieved for the purposes of an analytics, in all of those 3 categories, there's a double-digit interest, and there's a double-digit intention to implement data management tools. So that is sort of lays the foundation of why we need the product sets that we do for Hadoop. And then can we potentially use the existing tools? So in case of the 2 customers, one of them had Oracle and the other one had IBM InfoSphere, right? But they have an inherent problem, one of which is, they're unidirectional. They're good products in their own right, but they had unidirectional data movement. They had limited integration with Hadoop and other non-traditional data format types. And they obviously focused on transactional systems. They also had static and limited identification patterns. And that's key because if you're trying to also derive facets and different kind of context from a data that you've not seen before, for example, a video image or from a recording, these are all unstructured data sets that are eventually going to, or records, for example, the previous slide talked about records and documents. So the context around that needs to be picked up by a tool that is capable of a non-traditional data format. So they had very limited identification pattern. They're also not very adaptive to the changing schemas, which is the whole purpose of having non-RDBMS implementations. And I say that my choice of words is very careful there because not just Hadoop, but there are other NoSQL products like MongoDB that supports JSON that allows you to have an evolving schema. So that's the key thing as well here. And then in a couple of these cases, performance was of huge importance, right? This is a single SMP server that has InfoSphere running on it, and it's getting bombarded from every location, 50, 60 different intakes and outputs, if you will. So performance gets pretty limiting in that scenario. So as we went down the data management layer, and I already mentioned this, right? There were two key retailers that we worked with, and the goal was to extend the analytic data lake. So there are two sort of sections here. The first section is the need for the processing itself on data lake. They did analytics today, but they wanted to move ETL into this. Now, ETL, for any of those of you guys here have a retail experience, it is a hairball doing ETL, particularly with products which have been around for a really long time, and they're good, DataStage, Informatica. If you ever want to do a workflow reverse engineering, good luck with that. It'll take you a few months, if not years. But they had a lofty goal in that they wanted to build a next generation data lake and have a distributed platform as opposed to an SMP, Oracle, or any other RDBMS-based system, which is what they were using today, right? And they had thrown enough amount of hardware in trying to scale that ETL alone. So the project actually initiated from that point of view that, hey, can we take the analytic data lake and extend that to be more of a transactional system? Now, we understand there are limitations on the asset side, asset compliance side, and a whole lot of other CAP theorem also, right? From a CAP theorem concept perspective, that is not the right platform, but we're going to attempt to do a distributed ETL platform. And they would eventually move more users against it, have more reporting against it. And really, now, this is one of the bigger retailers within the US. And in-store SKUs are ever increasing. 500 million is not much when you think about it. But when you have to do an ETL, and as I said, it was a hairball of a ETL with 1,000 lines of code per workflow. So it becomes very complex. And then, so the second, sort of the second facet of this project became, well, we already have an MDM tool. Why don't we just use that? Well, we ran into two major problems here. One is that the tools were not well interfaced with Hadoop and MPP databases that I'll talk about. And there was little to no interest between the EIM team. They are sort of more structured in the way they operate. So what I will talk about, as I said, between those two facets, I'll focus on trying to explain how we evaluated the data management tools and prototyped them. So this was the high-level architecture. So again, this is the architecture for the next generation data lake. On the right side, you would see a bunch of different technologies, and most of them, they're used in isolation, but they're collectively trying to call that as a data fabric or a landing zone where all the data will be. And there's a bit of interoperability by way of APIs between, let's say, the object store and NoSQL, and so on and so forth, right? And on the left side is all the sources. So today they get the product data and the vendor data in a flat file format in CSVs. So, and they move the data. The notion of introducing in-memory processing was also new because this would be a transactional system, right, for them. So part of the things, depending upon the sensitivity of the data, could actually be executed just in Spark. There's no need to persist it, or maybe persist it asynchronously. Metadata would be sort of, in the diagram, it's represented as if it is in band, but fundamentally the dashes in the arrow show that they're actually out of band. And what I mean by that is that when you're inserting the data into Hadoop, you're actually not waiting for the metadata data to be inserted or assessed before you ingest the data, right? So it is happening basically out of band, but simultaneously. You could actually, we evaluated a few tools whereby we decided or we assessed if there is a Kafka bus that you're using to ingest the data, could you have two taps? One tap could be going to your metadata platform and another tap could be going into the persistence layer. And then from a querying perspective, they also had a very lofty goal in that they wanted to be able to make this very adaptive, for lack of a better word, right? So you have an end user coming in. By definition, if that user could be identified through the enterprise security framework as being somebody who has access to the most sensitive data, now that information as to how do you identify a person as having access to the sensitive data is defined in the policies framework. Again, that would be more of the custodian of which would be the data management tool, right? So therefore, we sort of focused on these two areas as we started down the path of evaluating products. Some of this you might find a bit repetitive in that, but these are relevant as we started to evaluate data management tools. Would the tool be efficient enough and has the capabilities to source data off of a Kafka bus or off of a Spark stream, right? It should be able to also handle complex data sets. So, leg 3 or facet 3 of this project was if you have somebody checking out something at the point of sale counter and you have a video analytics recording that data and you ingest that in memory right off, can you do some forensics activity on that video, right? It's a novel concept, and typically really only financial companies have been able to do that. So if you find, for example, an individual who is on the wanted list, right? So can somebody, the custodian of that data, which is this retailer, identify who that person is and sort of inform the authorities in real time? So hence that video file became another important use case in the evaluation of the data management tool. So I mentioned the in-band and out-of-band. So in addition to that, could that tool, and actually the point number 3 where it says data placement based on sensitivity and priority, that's actually more of a custom development where you are defining your taps. Where does the data go? Does it go to in-memory or does it go to a physical spinning drive, for example? So that would be more of, it was not a function of a data management tool because that would be out of bound, but it would still be an important consideration as we pick up a tool. And of course, performance requirements, that was something that we started with anyway. Now, given that I've already mentioned that there were multiple facets of this project, and they already had one existing, I don't know if that slide was there or not, but they basically primarily had ODBI compliant distribution. So they had Pivotal HD with Hawk in one cluster, and they were building up Hortonworks based with the Hawk front-end NoSQL cluster, right? And then they also had Greenplum database, which is a technology that EMC owns, Pivotal owns. So they had a myriad of these. As they extended the next generation data lake, they had the option of starting from scratch, completely greenfield, instead of reusing the existing cluster, because that could be dedicated for analytics. So as we did that, we decided to assess the file format characteristics. Which file lends itself to a better metadata capture so that the work done by the data management tool is going to be much less. Smart thinking, right? But it got complex very quickly. So historically, they had been a good user of CSV text formats, which I would say majority of the people here would be using. But Avro was certainly increasing in footprint, and that's a good thing because it allowed, Avro as a file allows embedded metadata. It also allows evolution of schema that kind of fit into the other requirements for the customer. So we went down this path of evaluating which one would be a good fit, and then all of this, so this is sort of, in order to fit on this slide, I just have about 4 or 5 columns, but they also were evaluated on things like what would be the impact on read-write performance, what would be the level of effort needed from your source applications and from development team in order to change the data as it's incoming. So if you have a vendor data that's CSV, but you want to put it in an Avro format, what do you do, right? So the level of effort was also sort of taken into consideration. And then for data management tools, the hierarchical model becomes very integral. right? So again, there are some formats that allow hierarchy representation, particularly JSON does a really good job at that. So ultimately, we decided to sort of, for the purposes of this project, focus on these 4 format types. Now, that's not to say that JSON wouldn't be considered, because they had another project going on with MongoDB, right? So I would just say that if you were to take this as a takeaway, I would say that this is a good starting point when you start to do an evaluation, especially in a net new Hadoop deployment. So moving on to how did we evaluate the data management tools? Our first challenge, too many tools in the market. How do we even do a short list? And each one of them had everything. They had metadata management, they had security, policies, integration, right? It just went on and on. But I think what we then decided was, let's build a list of KPIs which are important to you, Mr. Customer, and then sort of take that as a starting point. And this is where we engaged with the subject matter expert teams within the organizations who were in EIM, even though as resistant as they were to getting engaged at the beginning, right? But they were really coming in from the point of view of, share with us the best practices, share with us what does the business need, and what problems you had in the past. And then we sort of just took the top 5 of the ones that we saw from a market share perspective and sort of the popularity perspective in terms of the vendors we selected. And then from an implementation point of view, we also made sure we don't want to do everything under the sun. So one requirement for data management tools was, can it integrate with the heritage EIM product, InfoSphere or Oracle MDM? And that would have been a behemoth task, but for the purposes of the project, we said, let's table that for a minute. Let's at least do the evaluation, which tool would get us where. So the next few slides could be a little bit boring, but these detail out the specific activities and KPIs that we started with, right? So for metadata curation, data profiling, and data classification are very similar things, but in the way the tool does that can be a huge difference, right? So where does a business metadata get defined? Is that a separate repository which is portable? Can you do a backup of that database? What database is it? Is it scalable, right? Those things become important. Then things like, what range of file formats? That's a given. We started with that, right? Can it read JSON just as well as it can read CSV? And what is the level of metadata context that it can pick up from a text file? Because one interesting point that came up here was, there was call records from the support team, so the CRM data. You have multiple text columns within the data that is dumped out of that. One record says, this is how the customer had felt towards that call. So those are the notes. Then there is a feedback from the person who took the call. The context of those 2 columns is entirely different. So can metadata at least tag or put a facet around that kind of data that says, this is inbound, this is outbound, from the point of view of the vendor. So reading each file to extract the metadata, associating facets to it, which I think is in my next slide, that's classification. And then can the product actually read the files which are already in HDFS, as well as the ones that we are bringing in from the Kafka stream or from Spark stream? The rest of them, I think, I would not bore you to death. I only have 10 more minutes left. So, and then where do you store this profile data? This is actually, so there are 2 repositories. The main repository would be the data goes to HDFS. And then there would be the metadata repository, right? Custom tagging is key. The terminology that the business analysts use are very different than what IT uses. So does a tool have a capability of tagging? And that allows and enhances search. So translation and integration with industry models. So in retail, data models are very important. They have sort of been an invention of Teradata, if you will, right? But then other vendors or other verticals, financials, they have their own models, and medical industries have started to have their own models. So what is the level of integration? Now, what we also did was we associated weights against each one of these entities, each one of these evaluation criteria. It became a very complex spreadsheet by the end of it. From a classification perspective, this is very important because when you want to find data, you want to be able to crawl it. That's what Google does. It crawls the data that is put on the internet. When it crawls it, it is heavy on CPU, it's heavy on I/O because it has to read everything and it has to index it. The question becomes, first of all, are you doing it inbound, out of bound? What's the performance impact? And furthermore, is the previous index offline or online? Right? So all these things become important in evaluation. Then once the data is classified, is the content, the context searchable using an API? Or in other words, is there an API that the product exposes to be consumed by some other application, for example? The richness of natural language processing toolkit, that's what typically would allow you to do content analysis and content search. Data remediation, same data coming from multiple sources, which one's the right one? And then furthermore, which one is the right version, which actually is in a separate category, but the two might be very closely related. Data archiving and policy implementation, right? So 10 years, 7 years, can the tool actually keep track of that as to this particular table is meant only for retention, however, this is a copy from XYZ year, 7 years earlier. Notification, so as the data comes in from the sources, is the data management tool getting updated and thereby sending notification to the end user, or does the user have to log in and log out, or they have to run another job in order to get the metadata associated? So this kind of covers sort of your, this covers the metadata and the quality aspect, the few pillars that I went through in the beginning, right? So, and like I said, there would be a little bit of overlap depending on how you look at it, but this is how we started. Lineage and versioning, this is, and I was in the community showcase yesterday, and there were a bunch of demos going on. Lineage is important. You want to know where the data is coming from, but what level is furthermore important. You may have a table, but you want to know what source that table is from. Is it from the actual source? Is it from an intermediate source? What version it is? So the level of maturity of a tool to not predict, but assess that is very important. Ability of the solution to sense and preserve metadata versions that I mentioned before, right? And then deduplication of the same thing. So this kind of covers, and the one thing that's missing here that I forgot as a bullet point is, who has access to this? So this is where the security comes in. What version which person has access to what version? Integration. Now, integration is, I would say, two faces to the same coin, right? The integration to your internal systems. So basically, the metadata artifacts that you have collected, and then you expose those APIs to talk to either a security-based system, the SIEM system you might have, or to your extended EIM system for lineage. And then integration also with the sources. The security tools like LDAP, and where you define ACLs and encryption, which is actually already embedded in data lake, are all important. This is also where you want to have rules and policies. Performance, accuracy, and ease of use. So what we found out that if you do not have an intuitive interface, people don't want to use it. I think that goes without saying for every product, right? So are you able to visualize that? Are you also able to process the data on encrypted files, compressed files, level of error handling, efficiency of crawling, and then finally notification? All these are factors, as I said, have an overlap in the previous one. So this kind of covers your integration aspect. So the vendors we evaluated are these, right? Now, at this time, we did not test or evaluate Falcon and Ranger because I think they had just come out, and the customer was still building and sort of finalizing whether Hortonworks would be the platform or not. So we didn't evaluate them, but I'm sure the KPIs would still stay the same. So this is a scoreboard. This is a scoreboard or a scorecard. Just a template. All the sort of KPIs that I went through, we decided to put them in a spreadsheet and have a weighted average against each one of them. The first line here, that is the individual weight, tells you how important is that particular KPI, right? It may be, actually it should be probably 0 to 3. And then you eventually try to, for every vendor, calculate a weighted score. This is a sample of what we came up with. I have obfuscated the vendors for a variety of reasons. But I think you get the idea, right? This is, again, what I'm trying to convey here is a methodology of evaluating data models, data management tools. Now, I will say, though, that all tools that we evaluated had pretty much a satisfactory interface with emphasis in just one or two key areas. And I think that's pretty normal in the industry, right? But your choice of tools needs to align with the business and the users at the end of the day. We found, and this may change, guys, right? Waterline did a really good job for automated data discovery and self-service. Attivio did a really good job at discovery and search. So what we find out, and this is where the detailing the architecture becomes important. They use Solr in the back end, which is a really good search engine. Global ID did an excellent job at being able to do logical maps and also actually security, which is missing here. And Ziloni also integrated well with external tools, for example, ETL tools like Informatica and others. And all of this analysis, as I said, was done in 2015. So by now, the analysis might give us a bit of a different result. But I want to just share what we sort of concluded. Now, in the context of the two customers we worked with, we landed up using Global ID and Attivio as their metadata tools. Now, part of the reason was because they already had Global ID in their platforms. So the only addition was Attivio. So the key takeaways with what I've covered so far, I would say, is that the ecosystem is pretty rich. It's ever evolving. There are too many tools in the market, yes. But I think there is still a lack of policy engines and rules engine within the Hadoop framework that I feel a lot can be improved upon, right? From a customer point of view, really, this is all IT and business driven, and there should be no other reason to pick otherwise, if you will. If there is one tool that does not meet all your criteria, I think I would highly recommend to limit to 3 tools, because beyond that, I think the management just becomes a nightmare. And then from a process perspective, I think we did POCs with 2 of the products, and we just reviewed the other 3. We just didn't have time. So I think if you ever were to go back and do such an evaluation, I would say that do a combination of both, depending on your time frame. You also don't want to fall into a trap of analysis paralysis, where for 6 months you're basically just doing POCs and data management tools and kind of forget about your data lake project, right? But the functionality scope, the workflows, that all needs to be in some which way incorporated into your KPIs. The integration of the tools, again, as I said, in our project was delayed. It would depend on your own personal experience. And finally, we also recommended a professional services recommendation to both our retailers, because it was just a behemoth task to get everything together. And from a skill set perspective, the whole Hadoop exposure to all of these aspects is also still evolving. So professional services, level of effort, and implementation methodology becomes an important part. So this is my acknowledgement to all the references that I had in some of the diagrams, and questions. Yeah.
Timeline. How long did it take you to go from when you came in the project to the point where you actually implemented?
We had about 3 months of evaluation, and then the 4th month is when we put it into production, prototype/POC. We had a lot of help from the vendors, too, of the respective products. Anybody else? Yeah.
You said you experienced a lot of resistance from the EIM team initially. Was there any particular strategy you used to get them on board, or any specific turning point you would be able to share with us?
So I think the one thing I would say is that the more people know, the more inclusive they are made to be, the more helpful they become, right? So in our case, we just started inviting them to the meetings that we would have about performance issues on the transactional system, which had the ETL going into it, right? And so a couple of other systems. As they kind of got aware of what problem we were trying to solve in building the Hadoop data lake, they got interested. And I think that's what allowed them to share with us what they already knew about, the business in general. And yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Appreciate the time.